to keep it focused because you have many other people that are going to be talking. So I guess the way I can maybe contribute is just to say first that Bosnians have a huge solidarity, obviously, with Palestinians. And this was happening right from the beginning, like at the very beginning of our state. I think the very first week or second week of Bosnia getting its independence, it recognized Palestine right away. And there's reasons for that, like many different reasons. But one is we have history of genocide, obviously, as Bosniaks. There's also a connection which many people probably there would be aware of, but at times I have to educate the Bosniaks about it, which is that large amounts of Bosniaks went and ended up settling in Palestine, the general area. And I think a lot of them were then pushed out into Jordan, if I'm not mistaken, probably majority. But there's probably Bosniaks that are have some amount of Bosniak ancestry, probably all over Palestine currently. We don't even know all of them because not necessarily all of them remember or have that his like a knowledge of that history. But we do as Bosnians have always understood that connection and have always, I think, spoken up for Palestine. And you probably have seen our soccer fans during the World Cup that they were doing these huge, like 30,000 people out in the street chants for Palestine, which is you're not gonna typically see something like that. But our fans absolutely are highly aware of what's happening in Palestine and are very supportive. And our team even refused to shake hands with the Israeli team. If you guys ever watched that video of the game that happened between Bosnia and Israel, they refused to actually shake the hands of the Israeli players. So that tells you a lot about Bosnian position, or at least Bosniak position on Palestine. But Gaza is actually the reason why I decided a couple of years ago to depart from a lot of what I was doing, which is in climate, and focus on maybe teaching Bosniaks about their own history that are outside of the region, meaning they often don't speak the language, and that I think the rest of the world could probably learn and be benefited from some really hard lessons that we learned as Bosniaks during our genocide. So I decided to actually go back to Bosnia and go beat by beat, sort of cover the entire genocide, which is only really possible because the amount of sort of ground that it covers and the amount of crimes that it covers is manageable to maybe, even though it is ambitious, it is manageable perhaps, at least in 10 years that I think it's going to take to try to mark every single practically crime that we have any information about so people can get kind of a beat by beat understanding from the very beginning and the roots of this genocide to what happened during the war and then what happened after the war as well, because there were many aspects of genocide that are still with us in Bosnia and they're in a form of denial and erasure. So even though the mass murders have stopped, all the erasure of scenes of crimes, the erasure of the mass graves, and inability of Bosniaks to actually. Those of you that might not be familiar, but basically there was a Dayton agreement that kind of, I wouldn't say ended Bosnian genocide, but it froze it. It stopped the murders, but it didn't really resolve the situation, and it rewarded essentially 49% of the country to the genocider. And the problem with that is that we now have basically two parts of the country with completely different histories being taught, with completely different upbringing for kids. There's a lot more, I would say, propaganda that's now possible than it necessarily was back in 1991, 1992, when still the propaganda was very powerful. But right now, because the everybody's sort of isolated to their own communities because it's really become, there's that word, balkanized. Um, so the problem now is that, at least my fear is that there's probably another genocide coming, and I kind of knew that for a long time, but I'd sort of stepped away from Bosnia for a couple of decades. So now that I've had a chance to go back, I'm seeing all these signs and all these kind of red flags of what may happen in Bosnia again. And Gaza is what really pushed me to say, look, we live in a kind of a horrific time now where you have the entire machinery of everything covering up the genocide as it's happening. And there's a lot of this sort of don't believe your eyes and ears of what's happening, even though we can all see what's happening. I think everybody can. I think you have to be very delusional to believe that there isn't a genocide at this point. but there is a powerful machinery to try to cover it up or to even like make you doubt your mind. I guess it's gaslighting might be the correct term. And there's a lot of that happening in Bosnia. There's a lot of gaslighting happening in Bosnia in the sense of trying to downplay what happened. So what I wanted to do is, for the first time, really go into a lot of those villages across the country and dispel a lot of, I'd say, myths. Like, for example, that genocide only happened in Srebrenica because that's the only one that was ruled by ICTY. Uh, I'm going to make a point that really the court itself used a genocide framework that made it practically impossible to even convict half the Nazis during World War II. If you were to apply their ICTY rules to World War II, you would actually let go a lot of the Nazi officials because you just couldn't quite fulfill the long laundry list of things. So I think we need to separate the court decisions from like the reality of things. We know that Bosnia had genocide happened across the entire country, and actually majority of it happened in '92, way before Srebrenica. 3 years before Srebrenica, majority of genocide had happened. So I wanted to actually go in and talk about sort of the how those situations came about, all individual crimes, how did those crimes happen, who committed them as best as I can, and sort of the mechanics is that went into making them happen. Anything from like how do you execute a genocide, from like having to bring in a bunch of like digging equipment in order to cover up the bodies, or how do you murder that many people. And there's a lot of that is like very perverse, and it's very hard for people to accept because it has an enormous amount of dehumanization, which is very, very difficult to accept. Much as it is, I believe, a lot very difficult to accept dehumanization in Palestine that's happening. It is a little bit in its sort of execution different because obviously here you have mass amount of people being murdered by large bombs, right, that are knocking out sections of Gaza and killing hundreds of people per building at times because they're like stuck in the rubble and dying. In Bosnia, a lot of the genocide was really hands-on, meaning 50,000 rapes. Those were like systematically executed and brutally done. And when you hear the details of them, it's really hard to listen. It's actually very hard for me to read through without like feeling nauseous. And a lot of that sort of like the sort of the killing, torture, maiming, all those things was very much hands-on. It was like one-on-one soldiers doing it to other people. So it's very, very hard to digest all that. So I wanted to actually take time and cover as many hundreds, thousands of those as I can so you understand like all the aspects of it, like psychological aspects that go into doing something like that, all the sort of gruesome aspects. Because it's important not to, engage in cognitive dissonance. So I wanted to really destroy engagement in cognitive dissonance, which is that every time you hear something, your mind tells you, oh, maybe it wasn't as bad as it seems. Like your mind constantly keeps telling you, oh, it's not so bad, but it is bad. It's actually way worse than you think, way worse. So now I'm wanting to bring every one of those details and also for people to understand that just how diabolical some of it was, because it was often done by people that knew one another, had grown up with one another, went to work with one another. Actually, I've found at least 200 instances, at least, I didn't even keep count, of godfathers, meaning people who are like literally godfathers of somebody in a family murdering them. Like, how does that happen? So it's about understanding like that a lot of it really was people hiding their true intentions and their true selves for a very, very long time and waiting for opportunity to kill. And that is a very difficult part of our genocide for people to understand or to accept the idea that somebody was coming to your house and hanging out with you for years, but really all that time they were thinking they were waiting and biding their time to kill you. It's really hard to understand that, right? And in that sense, it might be a little different than something like Gaza, where there's a lot more separation, right? Like it's not like there's a ton of Israelis living among everybody in Gaza and had been for 50 years now, and then they do it. But it was at the beginning, right? As much as I understand, there were a lot of like, technically refugees, right? Settlers that came over from Europe, and they definitely lied about their intentions. So think of that as being something that happened over like almost a century in Bosnia. So it was very, very hard for Bosniaks who had for years rejected the idea that like what had happened at the beginning of last century was possible to happen again. But that was all about engagement with cognitive dissonance. And I think this engagement with cognitive dissonance is a problem across the board in every genocide, in every situation, because our brain always wants to think there's no way other people can view me as less worthy than an ant. It's very hard for me to accept that somebody has conspired against me for decades, all those kinds of things. And it's very also hard for you to believe that they'd be willing to do the kinds of things they were willing to do. So I think for me, it's really important for our people to understand that the ideology that brought that about has not gone away, and they'll do it again. Like, in other words, they're probably planning right now how to do it again. I don't know how many of them, and I don't know in what capacity, but I can guarantee you they're planning and thinking about it. And I think a lot of this onslaught of them buying drones is part of that mentality. I don't think Serbia and Republika Srpska, which is the Serb entity in Bosnia, are striking deals with Israel because they're just wanting to make some money or they're wanting to appease somebody. They're creating essentially, they're setting groundwork for another genocide, to have the tools to accomplish another genocide, and also to get the international support in committing another genocide. And I think if they look at what's happening in Gaza, they have to be encouraged from that standpoint, because they've allowed now what I think probably what 800,000 people to get killed. I don't know what the number is, but it's certainly not the numbers that are being told, right? I think we're looking at probably close to 1 million people that have been killed. And I think Serbs are, they may be evil, these guys, they're not stupid. I think they're looking at the situation and looking at it like, there's a great opportunity for us to quickly now build some support and set things into motion so we can actually accomplish what we always wanted to do, which is sort of finish off all the Bosniaks and entirely wipe them away and build the ethno state in Bosnia. So that is something that I knew that I have to start waking people up to, because our people are much more so, I would say, than Palestinians. They're much more likely to engage in fantastical, magical thinking. Like, they go through a genocide, and like 5 years later, they're like, "Ah, it's fine. We're just gonna forgive and forget." Except these guys are not gonna forgive, and they're still planning to kill you. So if your mentality is forgive and forget, and you don't think you need weapons, and you don't think you need to defend yourself, well, just wait a couple of decades, and you're gonna be back into mass graves. So that's my point to them: is like, here's what happened. Don't fight it. Accept it. Accept the facts, which are now forensically like proven. This is not disputable. Like, we know what happened to a lot of these people because forensics tell us what happened to them. They tell us about the tortures they went through. They tell us about the kinds of murders and the ways that people were murdered. There's also like something about the fact that mass amounts of bodies in Bosnia were missing heads. You don't see that in too many conflicts around the world, that there was a concerted effort to essentially claim heads as like trophies. I mean, we're talking about some really sick people here, right? So it's important to understand that. It's important to understand how that would have come about, and the fact that it's probably going to happen again, and not to be a fool. I think I'm probably screaming in the dark, or maybe it's a pointless thing that I'm doing in that sense, because I don't see myself being able to turn Bosniak mentality around. But at least they're not going to be able to look at me if a genocide happens and say, "Hey, man, you didn't warn us." I did. You have either chosen to listen or not chosen to listen. And it's not just me. It's like everything that happened in the between 1992 and 1995 is a series of lessons. You either are learning or you're not learning. And if you're not learning them and they repeat, well, you can't blame anybody else. I mean, at this point, we live in an internet age. We have access to information, and now I'm putting it on social media, so it's millions, can billions can see it. And I'm seeing actually way more interest from Palestinian community about the videos than I'm from Bosniak community about the videos, which tells you a lot about Bosniak mentality. They're wanting to almost like, I mean, even when confronted with all these details and other kinds of things, they're wanting to run the other way for most of the part. But I think it's important for us to talk about it. It's important, I think, for the rest of the world to look at a lot of these things and learn that basically there are many different ways you can predict a genocide. There's many things that are very predictable, but our minds fight it. And that's why we don't predict it, because our minds want to portray everything that's happening around them as better than it is. And we fool ourselves and we delude ourselves into things, and then things get too late. Like, you arrive at a point where that the genocide has been put into such a motion that you can no longer like do all these things that you could have maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years earlier in order to try to stop it or slow it down or be more ready for it. So I'm trying to kind of appeal more to that. Like, you look at all our genocide, look at all the details of it, look at everything that happened prior, during, after, and try to apply it. And number one lesson I would say is, even though I call my number one lesson of the lesson videos to be armed and never give away your weapons, but really, in many ways, the number one lesson is not to engage in cognitive dissonance, meaning like, do not allow yourself to believe that things are better than they are. And then after that, armed to the teeth. It's going to sound weird, right? I was one of the first ones after the what happened in with the October 7th thing. I said, no, no, no. I mean, Palestinians need more weapons. Like, they need more weapons, not less weapons. Everybody was like, they need to be disarmed. No, 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 they don't need to be disarmed. They need to be way more heavily armed. I mean, look at our lessons in Bosnia. Is like everything was about like how Serb units across the board, across every village, across every town, everywhere, they were so focused on disarming. Their number one priority was disarming. Before they engaged in actual perversity, all the horrific things that they were doing, they first wanted to make sure that nobody can fire back at them. And if we were ready, I think if we had enough weapons and if we were ready, if we had the vigilance, then I think we could have probably prevented a lot of things that happened during the genocide. A lot. I mean, I could probably write a whole book on how we could have totally turned that whole situation around if we just stopped engaging in cognitive dissonance. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on and on, but if there's something like beyond you guys going and watching my videos, which you can, I'm going to be making thousands of them, and you're going to be hearing about every little event, and whatever is of interest to you, you can go and look at those. But if there's any other things, let me know if there's is important to discuss or would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Harun. Thank you for sharing your truth. I mean, you are a victim of genocide yourself, and your truth stands out more credible than anyone else's truth. So you said cognitive dissonance and do not believe that they are going to get better and do not believe, oh, the world was not going to allow it. And you have a proof from the Bosnian history. How many times was the genocide committed in Bosnia? And every time the people think, oh, it's going to get better, don't worry, it's not going to happen again, only to allow it to happen again. So it's been almost the last 150 years that
Yes.
every few decades there is a genocide against the people because every time they think, okay, it happened, it's not going to happen again, we move on and be
Yes.
nice. The UN will protect us. Can you tell us a little bit more detail about this? How many times?
If you look at the Bosniak people, they're spread between Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo. They're across those regions. There's some living in Croatia as well. In Bosnia, they're the majority. In the rest of the regions, the minority, right? So if you go back all the way to like beginning of 1800s, there were instances of genocide happening in those other places. Bosnia had its first major instance of genocide in 1873, which was Kulanbag, was the last town all the way in the west of town, or west of the country. And that was when a bunch of Serb villagers came down and probably murdered a couple of thousand people in an area. And then everybody there just forgot about it because that's your typical Bosnian engagement with its own genocide. Let's forget about it. That's how we engage with our genocide. We don't like learn from it. We just get dumber every single time for whatever reason, right? But what had happened was that we engaged every single time it would happen again, we engaged with cognitive dissonance. And that is certainly the case in like 1941 when there was a huge effort to get rid of all Bosniaks in Bosnia. In fact, more of them were killed in World War II than in 1992, 1995. I think some projections are up to 80,000 people were killed, as much as we can project, between 1941 and 45 in Bosnia. So basically, there was a huge genocide. And then instead of talking about it afterwards, the Yugoslav government, so when the Yugoslavia was formed, right, as a socialist state, they said to everybody, don't talk about the genocide. Well, publicly, you might not want to talk about it. I'll give you that because you were facing a bullet if you talked about it potentially. The government was punishing you for doing so. There is no excuse for not talking about it in your household. Like in your households, you should have talked about everything that happened, how it affected your family, who did it, the fact that the people who did it were now free and in fact living in your town often. You needed to keep people educated on that issue, and Bosniaks just chose not to do that. And then they really the way they engage with the genocide is very infantile, is the only way I can describe it. So what you mentioned now, I'm going to go back just to the UN forces that came into the region in 1991 as a way of like stabilizing supposedly. And that was when Croatia was being attacked, like north of Croatia, south of Croatia, Dalmatia was getting pummeled by the Serb extremists and were getting murdered. And then they brought all the UN and they stationed them really in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, right in the center there. And the Bosniaks responded to that was like, well, the West has brought, the Europe has brought UN, which means this can never happen here. They didn't even consider the possibility that absolutely it could happen. And that was very, very brutal. The way that it manifested was very, very horrible because people were sort of sitting back and saying, look, I mean, it looks bad over there, but because we have all the UN here, I think it's going to be fine instead of getting ready. So when things hit when Sarajevo was put under siege, people were still in the mentality, well, yeah, it looks bad and it's a siege, I guess, but it's in like 3 months, things are going to be fine. They were not going to be fine. And there were millions of little proofs as to why they were not going to be fine, including how UN responded to it. UN did nothing to protect the people. We were getting sniped and bombed right from the beginning, and UN did nothing to protect the people. So we should have immediately known it's not going to work. And because we engaged in this like infantile behavior, we allowed UN to go into certain other areas and call them safe areas and disarm the people. But you never give up the weapons. I don't care who comes down. I don't care if a divine being from the sky comes down and says disarm. You are not disarming. Period. Not only are you not disarming, if somebody comes and says, I want to take your weapons, assume they're an enemy. They're never your friend. They're never your friend. Because if they were your friend, they'd be bringing a ton more weapons to protect you and other means of protection, either like military protection or some kind of diplomatic protection. But that's not what happened in Bosnia. In fact, when you look at the situation, Bosnians were set up to be absolute fools and dupes. And then they were murdered in much larger numbers than they should have been if they were ready for it. So that is one of the big lessons of our. I don't think that lesson is so much applicable to Palestine because I feel like in Palestine people are aware of what's happening. I don't think they're nearly engaging in a kind of cognitive dissonance that the Bosniaks were, and they're certainly not shy to talk about what's happening to them. Whereas Bosnians are like, nothing's happening. They're chopping our heads off and they're raping 50,000 women, but nothing's happening. That's how Bosnians deal with this. So, if anything, I think Palestinians can teach Bosnians how to properly talk about and deal with the genocide situation. But I think what our thing can have, what's the benefit of our genocide is that if we look at all the facts and we take it all apart, we can really understand the dynamics and inner workings of a genocide in a way that is very hard in an unfolding genocide like Palestine, which would take like many, many decades after if it were to end, in order to go back and gather all the data and understand each individual situation. With Bosnia, we know a lot about each individual situation. So we have this hindsight that we can look at it with incredible clarity and understand here's how it happened, here's who did it, here's how it came about, here's the consequences of it, here's the fact that 99% of them were not punished and why. So, in other words, we can really dissect our genocide in a way that I don't think you can dissect any genocide that's ever happened in a way that you can Bosnia. And that is the big benefit of our genocide to the rest of the world. But I think we, as Bosniaks, are never going to learn from it. That's the unfortunate part.
No, inshallah, you will. We will. We are learning from you too. So you think the Board of Peace is not going to protect the Palestinians, and that
No, I don't
the
think so.
demand for yeah, give up your weapons. The Board of Peace is going to come and protect you.
No,
And
no, absolutely not. And in fact, we had a horrible lesson of that. Besides the UN, there were lots of Bosniaks outside of Bosnia. Let's take, for example, Bosniaks living in Turkey. There were millions of ethnic Bosniaks living in Turkey that had gone to Turkey when the Ottoman Empire retreated, right? Those people didn't get up and come help the Bosniaks. Do you know what I mean? Like, they did very little to help us, even though they were literally our ethnic group. So, in other words, you cannot trust anybody but the people you're stuck in a situation with. That's the only people you can trust. And that's the people you have to organize with, and that's the people you have to arm heavily, heavily. I mean, it makes me sound like I'm a spokesman for the NRA in the United States. So all my left-wing friends are going to look at me and say, "How dare you? How dare you be pro-guns?" But my response to them is, that is the lesson of my childhood. The number one thing they wanted to do is to take the guns from us, and then we're all dead. Like you can engage in magical thinking about your own country, but I'm giving you the reality of the situation, and that is that we needed to organize with the people we were stuck with, be ready for it, and be well armed, and we got everything wrong, which really then brings the question, how did Bosnia even survive? And I think in some many ways it was a miracle upon miracles that this happened. And I think part of it was that Serbs were way too afraid of us. They were so concerned about the fact that we were getting a very huge support from the Middle East, which we weren't. Our biggest supporter was Iran, if I'm not mistaken, and they sent most of the support and logistics and weapons to Bosnia, but that still was a very small percentage. So Serbs made really wrong assumptions, and that helped us. They assumed that we were much, much more organized and much more powerful than we were, and that kept them from doing certain things that they believed would be too dangerous for them to do, but instead, in fact, was not so dangerous for them to do. And I think if they knew the real facts and really believed it, they probably would have murdered everybody in Bosnia, give or take, or expelled them. So the miracle, I guess, of it all was partly that the enemy, the genocider, was not informed enough or was making some wrong assumptions. That saved us that time. I don't think that's going to save us next time. I think they too have learned their lessons.
Yeah, I mean, I think your assumption about the Palestinian was right, but believe it or not, Doctors Against Genocide, we warned of the genocide before October 7, and the Palestinians themselves told us no, no, no.
Ah,
This, oh no, you're crazy, guys. You're crazy. It's not going to happen. 21st century, everyone has phones, camera, media. The world is
no,
allow it.
no.
That was before October 7. It happened to us.
Yes,
And going to your timeline. Do you know when the genocide of the Palestinians started? It started in 1890, or when that with that Zionist Congress, was held in Basel, and they said, "Land with no people for people with no land." That was the first genocidal declaration, and the people did not believe that.
right.
Believe the criminals. When someone shows you their true color, believe them. Do not say no, they cannot do it. Oh, they are good Israelis, they're good people. I mean, believe it. That's their project. This is project from day one was genocidal. Then Balfour Declaration is the second genocidal, declaration, and another genocidal, point on the timeline. Then we have the 1936 when the president tried to defend themselves. That was a genocide. 48 was the first genocide. And people said, oh, it's not going to happen again. That was genocide. And the people, I mean, they're not going to improve. They are built on this. They're not going to change. They're not going to get better. As you said, even if you think, oh, okay, no, it's good, going to be good on your side. It's not good on their side. Even when you talk to the leftist Israelis are the one who committed the 1948 genocide, not the right wing. There was no right wing at 1948.
Yes,
Actually, the religious Zionists in 1948 were against the establishment of Israeli state.
yes,
Most of them, the majority were against. It was the leftists, the Gideon Levy people, are the
yes.
one who committed the genocide. Okay, in 1967, another bout of genocide. In 1982, in Lebanon, another genocide. It keeps happening. They will not change. They're
No,
built. The only way is to find ways to protect yourself. Never trust the international community. Never trust anyone. You have to protect yourself, and you have to also build a connection of supporters all over the world to protect you. You cannot do it on your own, unfortunately, when all major powers against you. So, I mean, thank you, Harun. I mean, there's a lot to learn from you. We want you to become, if you are welcome to become a regular contributor here. We really need to kind of all digest all the lessons that you learned yourself growing up into genocide, being a genocide survivor. I really think your truth is much more important than what all the progressive writers and stuff like analysts, all these people who want to whitewash the genocide one way or another versus someone who lived through it and know what it feels and knows that if the people in Bosnia had at least the minimum amount of ways to defend themselves, maybe they could not have stopped it, but the number of victims, the number of damage would be much, much less than what it is. And I
absolutely.
think this is, go ahead.
Absolutely. If they were ready for it, I mean, I'm now covering every event that's happened basically in the country, and I can already tell you the events that I've covered, which is like 50 events, I guess, or a little bit more now at this point. I can tell you probably 45 of them could have been averted,
If the
or like
people
massively.
have
Yeah.
the means to protect themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that tells you a lot about just how not ready we were, just how disorganized and stuck in cognitive dissonance the people were.
And actually, when we were warning our people about the possibility of genocide happening, we were talking about the West Bank, and the call was for the people in the West Bank, please have ways to protect yourself. The settlers are coming. They are coming. They are arming themselves. They are arming themselves because one day, when under the right political cover, under the right, excuse or red flag, they will come and slaughter you. So at least make sure you can protect yourself. And for protecting yourself, you cannot rely on anyone else. You cannot rely on, flowery statements by the UN. Things are concerning. What do you mean concerning? People are being mass slaughtered, and you're telling me it's very concerning what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank. It's not concerning. This is a genocide, a mass slaughter of civilian life of innocent people for no crime other than just being Muslims, like in the case of Bosnia, and in Palestine just for existing, You can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, you can be an atheist in Palestine. If you are not a Jew, then you are a target. So thank you. Anyone has any questions for Harun? We're gonna, I mean, it's not enough. I think we need to learn more from you, Harun. Then we have more updates from the West Bank. Go ahead, Maisa.
It's just Harun, amazing insights. You know, I'm currently in Ramallah, and Ramallah if there is a case of how to cognitive dissonance and how to pretend that you're in a liberated bubble or a zone that like life goes on, it's Ramallah. It's just one of these phenomena that breaks your heart because like nobody is safe. Like yesterday they closed off Ramallah for hours because the settlers wanted access to the main roads to protest. And, you know, the settlers can come in and kill anyone. So nobody is safe, but somehow there is this cognitive dissonance in Ramallah for somebody like me. I don't live here all the time, but I've been here for a couple of months now. And I'm just like in constant shock. Like, how do you pretend that something is not happening? Literally like a few kilometers away. And I think this is part of the plan and the design to keep us in a bubble and to keep us disconnected from each other and to keep us disconnected from our communities and completely like oblivious as if this is like, you know, the utopia of the Palestinian dream, which is, I don't know. So this is very, very helpful. Thank you so much, Harun. And we have Bashar Nidal. Bashar has been stuck behind the checkpoint. Thankfully he's safe. بشار تفضل احكي معنا بس حط لنا الكاميرا وشكرا انك